Welcome to the Your Life Unfiltered podcast with your hosts, Kitul Kathari and Deepam Jain. In this podcast, we dig deep into the life experiences of our guests to connect the dots between their early experiences and what they're doing today. Before I get into it, if you guys are not already following Your Life Unfiltered on YouTube or on Instagram, please be sure to give us a subscribe and a follow respectively. That's at Your Life Unfiltered. With that said, today we have a very special guest, Cara Black. Cara is a author that has written over 20 mystery/detective books, as well as some works in the historical fiction space. She's a best-selling author. Cara, could you quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Cara Black, and I usually write the Amy Leduc mysteries set in the different arrondissements of Paris. I've written 20 of them all over, and I've written two historical World War II thrillers, and I made the New York Times best-selling list one time. So, yeah.
That is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
So great to have you. And before we talk about your writing, your books, talk to us a little bit more about early childhood, early experiences. We noticed that you've lived across the world, Switzerland, Singapore, or Japan, where you also met your husband, which I know personally as well. So talk to us a little bit more about that, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. I basically grew up in California, but we had family back in Chicago, and one of my family members, my family members served in World War II, but I was young and little. I didn't really know, but it was kind of like, they say the elephant in the room, people damaged in war. Or, as a young child, you don't necessarily understand what that means, which I found out much later. I went to school here in California, and then I went and traveled for several years. I lived in Europe. I worked in Europe, kind of black market jobs. I went to school in Tokyo, where I met my husband, came back to San Francisco, and got into the early childhood program and became a preschool teacher and then a preschool director. And I ended up working in a Jewish preschool. I'm not Jewish, but didn't matter. And when I was working in the preschool, I remember every Friday they make like challah, the bread, and have And so we would make it with the children. We'd make like chocolate chip challah, and they loved that. And I remember one time I was at the desk and I saw this man. He was reaching over and he had numbers tattooed on inside of his arm. And somehow it clicked. This man had been in a concentration camp. He was just reaching for something, and I was just very casually, and I was like, never knew anyone or met anyone, and so I became very interested. And then I had a French friend who I went to visit in Paris a few years later, who took me around the Marais in Paris, the old Jewish section, and showed me where her mother had hidden as a young girl during World War II. She was a Jew, hidden in the apartment after her parents were taken. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, what? And it was Paris French police under German orders who rounded them up. But seeing this building and hearing, about her mother's being hidden, and then hearing that the concierge of the building, like the superintendent, helped her eat because she had no ration coupons, and people didn't know what was going on then, and, like we know now. And anyway, all these things. And I think, as I was saying earlier, it was a story that just stuck with me. And I came back to San Francisco. I told my father, who was a big mystery reader, and he was saying, that's fascinating. You should really look into that. Before the internet, right? Okay, so we couldn't Google anything. Then I started writing, I had to write letters to Paris, in terrible French, and ask information. We had to do snail mail, and a lot of times, it was much more involved and bureaucratic. Then I got into a writing class at UC Berkeley Extension, got into a critique group, and it helped me form this story and make it a mystery. Which I thought was a great way to tell it, because I'm not a historian. I speak some kind of French, but it was really about the people, really character driven, what would happen. And I needed a detective, and she'd be smarter and more chic than me. And, she would, and she would be in the detective mold, but she could do computer security, which in those days was pretty cutting edge, you guys. It was before your time. It was really, in that time, there were 3 computer security companies, early 90s, in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. One of them was run by a woman. I read an article about her in the San Jose Mercury, and then she, when I finally found her, she had moved up to Seattle, and she agreed for me to do a phone interview, and she talked about, what it was like. So then I could have my detective schooled in the traditional mode of surveillance and, doing detecting work, but she could also have this other skill, and then she could be half American, which gave me some latitude with the character. She didn't have to be 100% French. So I hope I answered. And then I wrote one and I sold it, and they wanted another. They said, where, I said, okay. And they said, where is she going next? And I said, what? And they said, writing a series, aren't you? And I just lied and said, yeah, sure. Yeah, I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, in the days pre-internet, I had to write letters to my friends and say, look out your window. What do the leaves look like? In this, or I would call them, it was expensive, and I would say, tell me what it looks like outside. I forgot, I didn't take good notes, or, so it was interesting.
Wow. That is so interesting. So when it comes to the description of the city, that's interesting. So you actually got people on the phone to look out their window and describe what they're seeing. That's amazing.
Yeah, I was like to my husband, I have to make a really quick call to friend, which was very expensive, just really quick, but I have to know, right, and they're like, oh yeah, that's right, and then my friend said, no, I will go on my lunch tomorrow and I will go to that park for you and I will make sure that it has 5 statues or whatever it was, because it didn't really matter that it was 5 statues, but I had written 5 statues. So if you've got a succinct detail like that, you've got to make sure it has 5 statues. You know what I mean? I didn't write 5 statues. It was just, maybe I took a note, and I remembered that to show. So again, that's what I've learned in writing. If you've got it in there and it's so specific, you've got to make sure you can back it up.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Wow, that sounds like a completely different time, because now we take the fact that you can have an idea what something looks like for granted, because you have so many different options with the advent of the internet. So it's really interesting talking about how when you first got into the writing space, how things were so different.
I had to get, my friend had phone books, yellow pages and white pages in Paris. And they have, what is really great is the yellow pages. It's all organized by, you want to have dry cleaning, laundry. You will go to the arrondissement you live in, and then we'll have lists of the laundries. So I could look at that when I'm writing. Okay, they're in the 7th arrondissement. There'd be this, maybe on this street I could see there was a laundry, a dry cleaners or a butcher's. Or
wow.
So it was really helpful because we didn't have Google Maps, okay? And so I could do that. And of course, when I wrote, it was a couple of years later, and everyone goes, well, is that correct? I said, well, it was a 1997 phone book, and I'm going to go with that. It may have gone out of business 2 years later, but I think that's pretty reasonable. And I'm not I'm writing fiction. But again, it's that people call you on the details, so you want to get it right if you're going to do it. But so yeah, we didn't have Google Earth. I had a copy editor who made a note. She said, on Google Earth, I don't see how they could have escaped from one rooftop to the other in this area, this and that. I said, well, in 1999, it probably didn't look like that, and maybe they were doing construction. Give me a break, right? You're reading this and, sure, now you don't see them. When you're running across the rooftops in Paris, they could have had construction. So that's the part you got to...
Absolutely. And just to build off of that, right? So would love to learn more about your research process. Since these novels are set in various neighborhoods of Paris, how do you go about the research? and what basically draws you into these specific locations, and the stories that you weave around the different neighborhoods there.
Sure. Well, I have these phone books, that are really great. I love them. It's always like that wonderful little piece in my hand. So, I have the detective, and she takes a job, or she's asked to help someone, or some crime happens, and she's pulled into that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the real challenge. And the challenge has been to write about the different parts of Paris that, of course, I didn't know them well. I knew some, and to find out what is organic to that area, what you would find in that area, why she would be going there, what kind of crime, who lives there. And of course, every place in Paris has cafes, they've got the metro, they've got certain, but sometimes it's more working class or more bourgeois or, all that. And to get the pulse, to describe it as, I live in Noe Valley. I mean, and you know where Divya lives. So how would you describe where Divya lives? Or, how would I describe where I live? Which is hard when you live here. But as an observer, probably I see easier, in Paris. And again, it's the stories come from usually a real piece of information. Like my first book, I've gotten to know French police and detectives. Now they're even retiring. That's how long I've been doing this. These guys are getting old, so I can, I take them out to lunch and I go, tell me about a case that you never forgot, or a case that was happening at this time, because chronologically, do you remember? And they go, oh, I was a young cop, or no, but my friend in the police academy, he worked that case, or this would be interesting because this was happening, And that's great because they're working on crime, right? They're involved in, they tell you what it's like, what places to stay away from, or what kind of crime happens here, and so I always say, tell me what you think I should know. What was it like at that time, And I've been very lucky. I take them out to lunch, I buy them wine, and they talk, and, now they're older, they have more time, but yeah, I mean, and often they'll say, you may not, for my next Amy book, which comes out in another year, this policeman took me around and he said, I live here and I remember, what happened. There was this terrible murder, and he took me around and he showed me, and he showed me where he lived, and then he showed me where his friend, the other policeman I knew, his mother lived. And he said, if you're going to write about that time, you have to mention this crime that terrorized the neighborhood. So I was great. Yeah, sure. The book that came out last year was suggested by one of the scientists who runs the police crime laboratory. She gave me a tour. I got to meet her through an introduction, where they go and analyze all the liquids and blood and everything. And she said, I want to tell you, what you should write about. This is a great thing that happened, and this is what happened. And I'm like, yo. And then I met someone who lived in the neighborhood and who lived across from the police laboratory and said, yeah, there was a bomb explosion there, and threw me out of bed when I was a kid. So, of course, I had to use that in the story. I mean, nobody died because it was a political Basque separatist bombing, which was very political. They did them all the time, he said. But it was very much he just said, I was a little kid. And I landed up in the middle of the night. I woke up. What happened? And I was scared. And she told me all about it. And then she told me, this is how but here's an idea, and this is how you could do it. And I'm like, okay. She was great. We're friends now. She took me around. There are a lot of women working in police scientific laboratories. I was very, very happy to see that. I was very surprised, but
oh wow,
there were only two men working there. They said, "Why are they talking two men?" So my research happens because maybe I'm looking for something. I go to the archives. I'm trying to research a story, or I take people. I want to hear what people have to say, especially if they've lived there for a long time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right,
Has the research process now become a little bit more digitized, at least in recent years? Or is you still like to take in-person interviews and things like that? Like the same style of research as you used to do?
sure, I do a lot online, but you know what? There's nothing that like walking the ground. It just doesn't, there's nothing like that. To walk there, to
Yeah.
see what the light is like, to smell, the bakery or I don't know, someone smoking or hear the sound of, high heels on the cobblestone. There's just nothing like being there and walking, even if you have to research part of it. But I think I want to bring my reader to that street in Paris. And you got to go there, you got to walk it. As my next book, they go to Cairo. I've been to Cairo, not in 1942, but but I mean, I think for me, the best thing is walking the ground, being there, seeing how things are, things that you can only get by observing, hearing something, just hearing this thing that you're going, that you can't plan for. I like that a lot. I mean, otherwise, I like going into archives. It's so archaic. It's old school.
That makes sense. And to go off of that, your books are often, explore themes related to French history and culture and all those things. What's been your favorite historical era and or the events that you had put your research into that you basically then made a form of your book?
Well, they've done two. So the Amy books are from 1993 to 2001 so far. And I have to say, I like the ones in the early 90s because we don't, I mean, is computer savvy, but we don't have the internet, And that really is liberating.
Right.
They have cell phones, okay, because they were ahead of us technologically. But are there some, no, there is internet, but there's no Google. I mean, there was chat rooms and, all the listservs and all that. But it's just not like pervasive like it is now. So I like that. It gives you more freedom. You've got to go out and look for information and talk to witnesses and see if that's a real alibi, which you have to do anyway. That you can't learn on a computer. So I like that part now that I'm not restricted. I've been writing about World War II for 2 books, and I find, and I'm working on a book post-war France, liberation, post-war, and I find that fascinating because it was so not like we think. There was rationing. They had the coldest winter they ever had in France right after the war, because there were no services. The infrastructure was bombed out. I mean, there was nothing. There were no horses. There were no cows. There were, factories. Everything. It was like everything was like COVID 20 zillion times more. There was nothing going on. You couldn't. The British said, we won the war, but we're on rationing. We don't have food to eat. We don't have coal to heat. So I think it's really interesting that we, especially, where we don't come from Europe, we have this presumption, the war's over. It's all, no, the newsreels don't show everything. So that's a fascinating time.
Of course.
People picking themselves up and coming to terms with, personal loss, no services, lost family, all that.
Got it. So how was the research for this particular aspect of of your last book as well as the one that's upcoming as well? Because I imagine it must be really hard to find information. This is, because it's set in World War II, so we're talking 1940s, right? As opposed to your usual series of books, which are set in late 1990s. Sure. So how did you go about the research process for that era?
Well, so the first book is set 1940. Where is it? Here. 3 Hours in Paris. When Hitler comes to Paris for 3 hours. And now, next Tuesday, a week from today, this comes out. Night flight to Paris. And that, so it's 2 years later. So 1942. So the first one, that put me in that mode is that what I realized, the more I started, I went to the London, to the Imperial War Museum, and they have, archives there. I went to the Churchill War Rooms, which are, in the downtown London, left as it was during the war. They just left everything. It's amazing, amazing. And I describe a lot of it in the book because I just wrote down what I saw, so tiny. And so I could, those were invaluable, right, to set a scene there. But what I was looking for, I found because some files had just been declassified. So as I've been writing, more and more files, it's like 80 years now, right, since the end of the war. So more files are being declassified. So there's stuff there we have no idea about that's just got this date, whatever, if it's arbitrary or it's just for, privacy or whatever, family member. There's things there we just don't know about. And I found this female woman, a British historian, military historian, who goes all the time, and she's written several books, and she will be there, and she talked about, today I got something I didn't know existed, but it was just released. And I went and I looked, and I was like, amazing. She's on the ground there, outside London at the archives. And I'm like, wow. And one of her books was really helpful to me. So I wanted to bring a different spin on this time, especially women's role, because I'm sorry, these books are all about men and written by men. And so I wanted to find these roles, and women did a lot because the men were either serving, prisoner of wars, or dead. So, women had to step up, whether they worked in a munitions factory. A lot of them did signals intelligence. I found a book by two sisters who were both young women who got, learned code. They could encrypt and decrypt. They didn't work at Bletchley Park, the very famous place. They were sent out in the field. One was in Italy, one was in Greece. They'd be getting the Morse code or whatever, however they do that, and decrypt it, sending it to Cairo, and then Cairo would be whatever, someone has to decrypt it and give the vital information for, troops and, all the important things. And so she wasn't an agent, she was just coding and sending it out, and that was vital, and they felt it was very important. They did a good job because people's lives depend on it. So I found out all these things women did. But the reason, too, we don't know a lot, especially about it, is that you signed the Official Secrets Act. When you were joined, when you were enlisted, you don't talk. And they never talked. They're in their 90s. They never talked. And because it's that generation or that strength. So a woman, when I first started writing that, an older woman died in Bristol, England, and a very nice woman, but didn't seem to have any family or many friends. And so they went there, and they were going to put her in a pauper's grave because she didn't seem to have money or anybody. And they looked in her drawers. She had the Croix de Guerre from France, the Hero's Cross, War Cross, decorations from the British, whatever the British one is called, and a whole thing. She had been in SOE, which is Special Operations Executive, which enlisted 50 women. They had like 300, and they parachuted them into France because they could speak French, or they were half French or whatever, and they would go and work with the other clandestine agents and networks, either doing setting up wireless for them to communicate, doing sabotage, or bringing whatever they need, money, papers, all that, they need. And women blend in, right? Women are just on the train or whatever. And she spoke French. So this woman had done that. I mean, and she was a hero, and they looked, but no one ever knew. And they took up a collection, she shouldn't be buried in a pauper's grave. She gave a service to her country. And so, there's people like that, and again, they took it with them, or, there's stories of a couple that were married. They didn't know until the file was released that they had each been in a secret part of the organization that, they'd never met. And so they never even told each other, and they were married like 80 years or something. So it's just this thing. And so, and again, with these files coming through, there's things down the road, they're going to learn new things about the war that we don't know, and I think it's generational. I've been talking to this historian. They said, well, right after the war, some people wrote about it, a sanitized version, maybe, because you have to keep morale up and,
Yeah.
we did this meant something and all that. And then maybe 10 years later in the 60s or 50 in the 70s, you got, more, like the Great Escape movie, or you have people talking, and then you have the 90s with new files coming out. So the generations are picking up, and a lot of the governments had a big investment, right, to make it look everything was good. We were all on the same page. We all worked together, which was not true, but that's true of anything, right? Especially in France, de Gaulle fostered this myth that everyone was resistant. You know that, right?
Wow. So it sounds like there's a lot of propaganda involved, right? There's a lot of propaganda where the story is spun in 1,000 different ways depending on where you reside.
And de Gaulle spun it very much. Everyone was a resistant. Everyone, and in reality it was like, 7%. But what is resistance? What is resistance? And what is collaboration? Is resistance, is it defiance and accommodation, which I think are the better terms? Because my friend's mother, right, the hidden Jewish girl who inspired me to write the first story, she was 14. She came home from school one day. The family were gone. In 1942, nobody really knew what it meant, like we know, and said, and she went to the concierge, well, where are my parents? When concierge didn't know. So she just went back to the room, slept, went to school the next day, came home, they weren't there. Now, she had no ration coupons because she was 14. She had no identity card, which you get when you're 16. She had nada, basically, only thing that was in the apartment. And what happened was that she stayed in the apartment, and then the concierge's son was a policeman. And he had rounded some people up, but he came back and he said to his mother, tell her not to come home from school today. Come home tonight. And because they came back to look for her.
Oh, wow.
So the concierge, and then all during the occupation, the concierge fed her, which is huge, because those people had, they had these ration coupons. They had 10 grams of fat for a year or some ridiculous. These people did not have, unless you had, family in the country. So I think that is defiance. I think that is resistance. They fed that girl. They had to share, and who likes to share their food? That's a big deal, They didn't turn her in, Maybe he had to, collaborate with other things. But, I think that's huge. I think that's a hero. She was a heroine, her son too. That took guts. They could have been at risk. So there's that whole thing, maybe you don't do these huge acts blowing up trains, but maybe that's not your life, You're
Yeah, even little acts of heroism is still a really big deal, right? Because cumulatively, if you have a lot of people doing little acts of heroism, it actually ends up being a huge act of heroism in totality. So totally get that.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating. Wow. With that said, I guess when it comes to your writing process, how has that evolved from your first book to now? Because I imagine you've been doing this for quite some time now. It's probably changed dramatically over the years, right?
And also the character, which you're the lead character, Amy Leduc. So how's that character evolved over those?
Sure.
books?
Well, now she has a child, so she has a 3-year-old, so she's evolved, from that. But my writing process, I used to get up at 5 a.m. and write for an hour or hour and a half before my son got up, before I had to take the dog out, before everybody had to get up and eat and go to work and school and all that. And that was my time. That was my dedicated time. And I also had a job, and I got a lot done, in a year if you've got a concentrated amount of time. So I really, I just used it. Wasn't checking email or anything. And then when my son got older, I would write when he was playing lacrosse or something. I'd be sitting watching the game. You can't go home, you've got this time. So I would just be writing, just on handwritten. just notes.
Yeah.
You kind of grab time, somebody's gone away for half an hour, you just start, at the kitchen counter writing things, you find the time, as everybody does. And it was funny, there was another mother in his class, and also at lacrosse, and we were both sitting in the bleachers and we're like writing. She was a writer, and she was like writing, oh, I've got another 20 minutes or something. So yeah, now that I have the whole day, I tell you, it's a lot harder. I like pressure, I like deadline. If I've got a whole day stretching ahead of me, it's whatever. So what I'm doing now more is writing scenes. And a scene can be a page, 3 pages, 10 pages. But a scene for me is where we start somewhere, and things happen during the scene. Things change, new information is learned, they go somewhere else, something is revealed, and at the end of the scene, things have changed. So it starts one way, it ends up differently. It leads to the next. So again, and when you think of the whole book, how it, then afterwards in the revision process, I look at the pacing and all that. But it's really about...
Okay, so if you're doing one scene at a time, I'm imagining that you're writing out individual scenes and then you're somehow connecting those scenes together, probably shuffling around the order, etc. Is that the right way to think about it? Like when you go and take those scenes and translate it into the novels?
Well, so I usually write about 100 pages, because then I found the location that I'm writing about and the characters, and I write in multiple points of view. Which is what I do in both, in the Amy LeDuc series and in Kate Reese, the historical thriller. So with Kate Reese, I had a timeline because there was a deadline, especially 3 hours, in Paris. I mean, she had the German Dieter Gestapo, who was looking for her, had 36 hours to find her. So that's great. I just did the timeline. Okay, gave the time. She's doing this, he's doing that. Of course, he's trying to catch her and she's trying to elude him. And then he's got someone else trying to, take his glory. And, so it's all basically like this. What one is doing, the other one is doing. So that was great, and that you do at the, I did at the end, because it's on a, it's like this. Are they going to do it? Are they going to get away? Will it happen? Will she be discovered? How can she hide? Da, 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 da. And then, of course, there is blackout in the evening, so you can't just run around Paris at night because you will be stopped. What a curfew! I'm sorry, blackout and curfew. So the windows are blacked out and a curfew. So if you're out in the street, you're taken to jail. So your time is limited. You have to hide. There's all this extra. And in Night Flight to Paris, again, there's a weekend. Okay. Someone needs to be stopped. They're coming at this time. Certain things are happening. They need to get the target from a party somewhere, and where they're going to be and who's going to be monitoring it. So it is based on a short time frame, which I like because that makes the pace go, and everything is important. The Amy LeDuc books take place over 4 or 5 days, maybe a week at most. So it's, again, the stakes are high. People can be killed. Information is important. There's deadlines. So I work sort of so I'll write a scene in one character's point of view doing this, and I'm thinking the other character is on the way to meet this person, or just found out that this has happened, or has to, go to the drop meet and find the hidden message, so that way they kind of, I like that, doing that and writing in a third person point of view.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's like multiplicity of viewpoints, right? So you're trying to write in multiple viewpoints because it kind of enhances the overall clarity of the story in your head, and then you can translate that onto paper as well. That's
so
really
it's not so much backstory, so we see it as it happens. We're not told like, oh, he did this, he did that. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of that, but it's like you don't want to have this forward motion. So
do you have any inspirational mystery writers that you looked up to growing up that you tried to model the storytelling technique based off of, or did you create your own style?
Well, you know, Picasso said, all artists steal, but you need to steal from the good ones. Or, you
Yes.
know, the best or whatever, steal from the best. Because whatever I take
Right.
will never, it'll be filtered through my lens, right? It will never come out
Hmm.
like the way, I mean, I love Raymond Chandler, right? The traditional, you know, detective. I don't think he's a good plotter, but he can write. His writing is gorgeous, you know, and his metaphors. So, you know, I mean, I'm not Raymond Chandler, but I certainly was inspired. I love John le Carré, you know, the spy novels. Um, I I like some of the old ones, like my dad, like, you know, I have the Needle, Day of the Jackal. Um, I like a lot of, I don't know, I like spy stories, but I like it when they're character
Okay.
driven. You know what I mean? Not, I like spy thriller suspense, but it's not just about the hardware and, you know, all the, you know, explosions. It's about the humans. It's about the characters. So that's, I like a character driven, you know, I want to care about those people. I mean, I may not like all of them, but I want to be, you know, I want to feel
Hmm.
they're empathetic. Elizabeth, I like to read stories set in foreign countries. I like to read Elizabeth George, who was an inspiration, has a series in England. Deborah Crombie. Oh, there's lots of people. You know, I just, because when I read, I want to go. I
Got it.
want to travel. I want to travel in a book.
Okay.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Fantastic.
And speaking of that, actually, one thing that you mentioned, I want to go back to. So your new book is coming out next week. So what should the readers expect from that particular book, and what should they look forward
Character driven suspense and staying up all night.
to?
Well, that's
That's
what I
awesome.
hope.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
So,
Uh-huh.
well, and realistic and really a focus on women. And not that men are, you know, but women's role. Because, you know, what I was talking about, those women in signals intelligence. So, I mean, Kate, my sharpshooter, gets involved in that, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and she has no idea either. And so she's basically, it's 1942. She is a sharpshooter. Can I tell you a little background that might make more sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. For sure. Go
so
for it.
she's from Oregon. She grew up during the Depression in the 30s up in Oregon, in a rural, you know, on a farm,
Mm-hmm.
on a ranch. You know, she had five brothers, and her father, they're very poor, and her father taught her to shoot as soon as she could hold a gun because the brothers were all working on the ranch, and she needed to shoot for, you know, hunt for food, game, and to shoot. There were
Mm-hmm.
wolves, you know, there
Mm-hmm.
really were wolves up there, and to, you know, defend the farm. So she's a natural. That's her skill. She can shoot. It's like no big deal to her. Um, she ends up getting a scholarship on the Alliance Francaise and goes to Paris in 1937 when, you know, Paris was beautiful before the war and everybody was hoping everything was going to be okay. She met a Welshman and they got married. They went
Mm-hmm.
back to
Mm-hmm.
the UK. He was recruited. He's an engineer. They had a baby. They were sent up to the Orkney Islands. And actually, what her family, her husband and daughter were killed. And it's based on a true explosion of a submarine in the Orkney Islands. Anyway, so she's stuck in the Orkney Islands. She's working in a munitions factory. She's totally depressed. She wants to end her life. She lost her family. She can't get back to America because, you know, the submarines and and she's recruited when it's discovered that she has the sharpshooting skill. She's tested and recruited by
I
the
see.
British Section D, which is something I discovered in that was under, I mean, people never talk about Section D. It existed, and they recruited people before the SOE by Churchill. And so they were kind of cowboys, you know, British cowboys. They're kind of like, take these people, throw them into France, create havoc, you know, use them as fodder, basically. You know, because we
I
don't know
see.
what's
I see.
going on until we kind of organize and blah, blah, blah. And so she's sent to to parachuted into France, minimal training, to assassinate Hitler, who came to Paris for 3 hours. Now, I found that in a footnote in a history book. Hitler came to Paris for 3 hours, and he left. He never returned.
Oh,
Never
wow.
had a parade, nothing. And I was like, why? Why wouldn't he? I mean, what, he could have done what he wanted. Here's a picture.
Hmm. Yeah. This is actually
Oh,
a
wow.
pretty famous one. Yeah, I think I've seen this
Right. So
before.
on one side is Albert Speer, his architect. The other side
Yeah.
is Arno Breker, the artist. Okay? I saw this picture
Okay.
and I
Wow.
looked at the footnote. And after the war, Speer and Brecker
Hmm.
both wrote, a memoir or whatever about it. And Albert Speer
Yeah.
said that this, and they were with him, happened June 28th, 1940. Arno Brecker said
Ah.
it happened June 23rd, 1940, which would make sense since Hitler had just been up at the Belgian border to sign the armistice, right, with France. They had taken over
Yeah.
France.
Hmm.
And I was like, we know these men are with him. They both give 2 different dates. What if something happened? Why didn't this ever get corrected? I'm not a historian, but I thought it seemed pretty fishy to me. It just never,
Hmm.
I don't know. And I said, what if someone took a shot at him? I
Right.
mean, you never knew then, right? It could have.
Yeah.
And what if it was this American woman?
Right.
And what if,
Wow. Got it.
so that's what I did. And of course, she was set up by the British. Anyway, that's the book. You have to read the book. Somehow she survives. We know she doesn't shoot Hitler and comes back now, 3 hours. And it's 1942. She's up in Scotland training people with sharpshooting, assassination skills, shooting. And she's
Yeah.
pulled in by her old handler, who she doesn't trust. Says, you've got to go to Paris. Margot, you have a mission. Margot needs you. Margot is the woman she trained with, a woman who saved her life, who's a double agent in Paris, and says that Kate has to come. Only Kate. Only Kate's skill can, And she's like they're looking. I'm on posters there. The Gestapo wants me. But she knows he owes her life to her, and she's got to do it. So she's, and they give her a disguise, like a middle-aged Red Cross nurse. Anyway, it's a whole story about that. And the person, there's a real person who was Q for James Bond. So there was a guy like that. So she goes to that guy before he did James Bond, and comes up with things like cyanide pills in buttons. Explosives and cork shoot. Anyway, all these lipstick gun. Anyway, which she gets to use.
Yeah.
Anyway, so she is dropped into Paris, and things happen. She has 3 missions.
Wow.
One is bringing penicillin cultures to the Pasteur Institute, which really, when I was in Paris visiting the Pasteur Institute, a guy told me about this. I couldn't make it up. I had no idea. I wouldn't have known unless I took a tour and the guy started talking to me. I had no idea. It's not in any book.
Right.
And he told me. Anyway, and then she's on a deadline, and then she ends up going to Cairo. And I can't tell you anymore. I'd have to kill you until you read it. But anyway.
Yeah, I like that. Going back into the spy theme, right? The spy theme.
Yeah.
It's like, I like that.
No, it sounds actually fascinating. We'll definitely give a shout out to all of our listeners to check out the book as soon as this comes out, and hopefully we get a few readers your way. So, Cara, I think we are ready to move into the next section of our discussion here. We call it rapid fire. This is just to get to know you a little better on a personal level. Just basic questions, nothing fancy, but let me give you an easy one, and then
Easy,
we
yeah.
kind of go from there. All right, start with that. So, tea or coffee?
Coffee.
All right. Mountains or beaches?
Beaches.
All right. Morning person or night owl?
Morning.
Okay.
I figured that one with the 5 a.m. writing schedule. Figure that one.
Okay. Paris or San Francisco?
Oh, do I have to choose?
It's fine. It's fine. I gave you a tough one there. It's all good. What's your favorite comfort food?
Mm, Black sesame mochi.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. All right. So, what's your favorite virtue in others?
Honesty.
Great.
What's your biggest pet peeve?
People who whine. Whining.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
That makes sense. Wow. Okay. What's your secret superpower?
My secret superpower. Um, okay, I hope it doesn't get me in trouble. I know how to watch British BBC from the States without a license.
Oh, okay. That's an interesting one. Wow. That's an interesting one.
Okay. Okay. That's pretty interesting. All right. What's a superpower you wish you had?
I,
It could be unrealistic.
I wish I could sing really well. I wish I could. I would love to be a singer, with a good voice.
Oh,
Okay.
interesting.
Wow. Any kind of genre, or like you're thinking like opera,
Opera.
or what kind of
But I can't.
singing? Opera,
I
really?
mean, I
Okay.
have no
Wow.
voice. I'm terrible. I can't keep a tune. But I would love to be able to sing really well.
Oh, wow.
Got
Okay.
it. Got it. Okay. So, what's been your biggest accomplishment in the last 1 or 2 years aside from the books?
My son, having a boy, having a child.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Having a
Fantastic.
child and getting published is pretty
Great.
amazing. I was, very lucky.
Of course.
So,
Of
it's
course.
not easy, and it's changing all the time.
100%. 100%. All right. That's actually brings us to the end of our discussion. So before we wrap, do you have any recommendations for our listeners? And a recommendation could be book, it could be your book, or any movies that you've recently watched, podcast, any piece of media, or could be general advice as well.
Well, if you have Apple TV, my friend Mick Herron, he's a British writer, and he's written these books, The Slough House. They're really funny. They're really sardonic British humor about these special needs, dysfunctional MI5 agents who goofed up their job terribly, and they can't be fired because they know sensitive information, so they work in dead ends things. But it's really sardonic. It's really funny. Really incredible cast. So anyway, I love Mick's books, the Slough House series, and now they're made into Apple. The Slow Horses. They're called Slow Horses. So I think that's great, and I think people love that. He's really a good writer, and just the other side, and how intelligence. Maybe I'm just tuned into British intelligence. They're just such hypocrites. Not that ours isn't any different, our CIA. I mean, yeah, I'm not saying we aren't either, but I just, they lie all the time. But, they lie for a living, right? I mean, or whatever. And as
Right.
writers, we lie for a living too. So, well, we try to we lie
That
for
makes
trying
sense.
to make a living. But, I think, it's also, if you like something and you like reading it, even if it's more lighthearted or it's kind of a cozy mystery or, just enjoy it, escape. I think it's great to escape. Sometimes I feel like reading a light story. It doesn't have to be meaningful, because of the news and everything today. We can have something enjoyable, take our mind off it. So, yeah. I'm listening right now to the life of Charles Dickens, the writer,
Oh,
how he became who he was, and there's all these things I had no
Mm-hmm.
idea how he wrote these stories. He was like I mean, he was really different. Grew up in poverty, self-made person, a self-made writer, self-taught. Interesting, really interesting.
wow. Yeah,
Wow.
that's really fascinating. Yeah, so yeah, we will definitely check out that recommendation. Thank you so much for sharing that. It was an absolute pleasure learning more about your story, especially how trying to write was very different back a couple decades ago, pre-internet. That was a fascinating story. And I think you're right. It's like now I think the situation when it comes to writing is so different than it was pre-internet. So that was a fascinating take. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
Thank you so much for joining, Cara. This was an awesome conversation. If you guys are not already connected to Your Life Unfiltered on YouTube and on Instagram, please be sure to give us a subscribe and a follow respectively. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.